This is so exciting. Welcome. I'm not sure how many people we have on because I'm too stupid to look at the number, but welcome to the fifth annual Literary Agents meeting. We're so glad that you're here. If this is your first time joining us for a Literary Agents meeting, the Literary Agents is a science society of the BSI, and we're dedicated to studying and celebrating Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's works and his world and his life, uh, including Sherlock Holmes, but not just Sherlock Holmes. So we tend on these annual meetings to pick a theme and invite folks in to talk about something that may be a little bit more obscure, that may be a little outside the reach of your, 900th reread of memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. Our topic this year is the 100th anniversary of The Land of Mist, and we are celebrating the impending release of the Edinburgh edition of Land of Mist. And we're so lucky to have the editor of that book with us to chat. Mark is going to introduce her and talk about Land of Mist and her work editing that. And then we'll have a panel discussion about Conan Doyle and spiritualism more broadly. I'm going to throw this over to Mark. I will say that when he's chatting, I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions about the discussion, please put them in there, and I'll sort of pass them on, and then we'll swap over. So do keep chatting in the chat as it's going on. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ashley. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. And for those of you watching the recording after the event, it's lovely to see you all here. So it's my great pleasure to welcome to our meeting today Professor Christine Ferguson. Christine is Professor of English Studies at Stirling University in Scotland, where her research focuses on the literary Gothic and the British occult revival in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She's on the editorial board of the Journal of Victorian Culture, Victorian Review, and Victoriographies, among others, and she's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the English Association. Her major works include Language, Science and Popular Fiction in the Victorian Fin de Siècle, 2006, and Determined Spirits, Eugenics, Heredity, and Racial Regeneration in Anglo-American Spiritualist Writing, from roughly the same sort of period. And most importantly for us, as Ashley says, Christine is currently completing the work on a scholarly edition of The Land of Mist for the Edinburgh edition of the collected works of Arthur Conan Doyle. So, Christine, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to see you, everyone.
Yeah, that's great. So tell me a bit, I'd like to kick off by just asking you a bit about your interest in Conan Doyle and in spiritualism. And, which came first, as it were? How did this come about?
I mean, Doyle was always in the air for me. I'm a scholar of Victorian popular fiction. Doyle's unavoidable, and I'm sure, like everyone else in this meeting, I read and devoured the Sherlock Holmes stories as a child. But really, I didn't really return to him as an academic until I was fully immersed in work about spiritualism, trying to understand its religious and linguistic politics in the late 19th century. So I think I'm in a kind of funny position in that I come to Doyle primarily through spiritualism. I'm the person who's like, Sherlock Holmes, why are we talking about him? Not that I would never write Holmes, but a lot of the stuff that other people find really sort of tedious or outside the remit of Doyle is what fascinates me. And I think part of my work is to try and to end that divide between these two Doyles. I think they need to be together.
Yeah, I must admit, I confessed to you after the last time that we spoke that this is the area of Doyle's work that I know the least. And you very kindly sent me a reading list, which I am slowly working my way through. But the work I was most familiar with, obviously, is the one that we're talking about today and celebrating today, which is The Land of Mist. Started to be serialized, I think, July 25 in the Strand. And it comes out in an interesting period. I wanted to ask you about why it comes out when it comes out in 25, because he'd been publicly a spiritualist for 7 years at this point. Yeah. So what is there about the timing of the writing of this and the publication of this that means that it arrived at this point in time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the timing is really crucial. He has been hammering away with a non-fictional campaign for spiritualism for really it's 8 years at this point since the new revelation comes out, and it is not working. It is not landing, even despite the kind of second renaissance of spiritualism that's happening as a result of the First World War. And also, he's just embarrassed himself quite badly with the Cottingley Fairies affair in the Strand that does not go well. And I think even until that point, there's a lot of people who were with Doyle, maybe not convinced by his spiritualism, but thought that he was, a earnest, principled agnostic. That comes out, and it's a bit of a disaster.
Mm.
So definitely, this is an attempt to regroup, to do it in the pages of the periodical that makes Sherlock Holmes in the Strand, and also, a lot of people, read Sherlock Holmes, and there was a kind of reality effect from that, assumed that to be a real life character. Maybe he's hoping something of the same will happen with spiritualism and fiction, that it will be read as fiction, but also fiction that is somehow believable. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's quite I think desperate in its intentions.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you spoke recently about another kind of crisis that was going on at the time in
Mm.
British occultism, which was around a figure people here will probably know a fair bit about. It's Aleister Crowley.
Yeah,
And you've connected Land of Mist
yeah.
with the kind of politics around Crowley and what was going on, the Thelemic scandal and things like that. So tell us a bit more
Absolutely.
about that kind of connection, because that's really, I think you've really brought that out in your work.
Sure, yeah, I'll be talking more about I'm obsessed with Crowley right
Isn't
now.
everyone?
And reading his detective stories from the same period, his Simon F. Sherlockian stories, which are amazing, by the way. I recommend them. They're very strange. But yeah, Crowley and Doyle are not two people that I think most of us would put together naturally. They seem to belong to different eras. Their approach to occultism, it seems, I think if we think of Doyle's belonging to kind of eclipsed era, kind of old-fashioned spiritualism that is maybe sentimental and quite Christian and still is making scientific claims in a way that the new movement does not. It's not that they're not making scientific claims, but they're doing it through different kinds of paradigms. And then Crowley, who is salacious and scandalous and ultra-modern and is about sex magic and all of these things. But Crowley and Doyle are targeted by the same papers and the same journalists all the time, right? And they are written about in the same breath. Crowley is enfant terrible at this time. He has been accused of treason during the First World War for seeming to support the German cause. He's accused of maybe spying for Germany. And of course, he's just set up his Thelemic colony in Cefalù, right? The Abbey of Thelema, where people are going to go and take lots and lots of drugs and have lots of sex and maybe, get in touch with their higher guardian angel. And he's just had a follower die in 1923, Raoul Loveday, under really suspicious circumstances. This is all over John Bull at the same time
Mm.
that Arthur Conan Doyle is all over John Bull. And they're being attacked in the same ways. It's the same kind of arguments that they are exploiting a war-bereaved public. So I think it's really important to emphasize that the attacks on Doyle that are being made in this time, like at best, the nicest thing his critics could say about him is just that he's naive and that he's being duped, right? But much, much worse things are being said, which that he is deliberately trying to mislead people and exploit people at their very lowest. Um, and he hits back. He hits back in the press all the time, and then in sort of this novel. And I think we might talk about this a bit later. I think Crowley may be an influence for something that happens in the missing chapter, but we can talk
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the other thing you mentioned there is, and we were talking about this just before we started here, which is that the this book is a peculiar kind of multimedia experience in the sense that you get when it appears in different forms. I think in the book form you get annotations and appendices, don't you? And reading this again, having just reread for the podcast The Lost World, I was really struck how he's using exactly the same techniques to
Yeah.
create verisimilitude in The Lost World. He's trying to do it. So he kind of having his cake and eating it, doing, in
Yeah.
one way trying to create a fictional world that feels ultra real, and now in this time he's sort of defending himself with all these fictionalized accounts.
Yeah.
Makes it an interesting novel, I think, from that perspective. It feels very quite modern in that sense.
Absolutely. I think it is with its emphasis on the kind of modern everyday. Like I feel resonances or hints of like Wolf and Mrs. Dalloway when I read The Land of Mist, which doesn't sound like a natural connection, but the way in which you have these miraculous otherworldly things, these things in which human consciousness is being radically expanded or challenged, what I think it's capable of doing. And you've got motor cars honking in the background, right? You've got people, they're going to send telegrams, or they're going to take the elevator, and they're going to call someone on the phone. It's very strange. It's so much less exotic than the Holmes stories, even though it is
Yeah.
about otherworldly beings, which I think is remarkable, right?
That's a really good observation. I hadn't thought about that, yeah, as well. This is around the same time as you've got people like Machen and
Yeah.
psychogeography and things like that. One of the things that's really nice rereading Land of Mist, because I do a lot of work out of Bloomsbury,
Mm.
these are real places, real people as well that you're seeing
Completely. I'd
repeated.
love to do a Land of Mist walking tour,
Yeah, there should be one.
right?
Absolutely. That would be
All over
great.
South Kensington and Putnam Cart Road.
Yeah. So thinking about the origins, back to the origins of this book again, one thing that I'm interested in is that Conan Doyle seems to have said to Greenhouse Smith that he wanted to present spiritualism, warts and
Yeah.
all. And I've never really felt that Land of Mist really does that. So, do you think he was very serious in that intention? Was that just
Oh, I
fluff?
think he was completely serious in his intention. I think that he believed that's what he was doing, but it is at the same time absolutely not what is happening in the Land of Mist, right? Almost all of the phenomena are ultimately vindicated. When we do have one instance of a fake medium, he is so melodramatically bad. This is the brother Silas Linden of the good medium, Tom Linden. He's sort of, got a pitchfork and twirling his mustache. And we know from the beginning, and he's immediately overcome by our valiant male spiritual investigators. There are portraits in the because I mean another thing, just why now? What's he doing here? There's a lot of portraits of his spiritualist contemporaries in here. People like Felicity Scatcherd, for example, or William Hope, and they're real life people who have been exposed or accused of fraud very recently in the press. But when they appear in the Land of Mist, none of that is said at all, right? They're all ultimately vindicated. And his critics picked up on this, right? So a lot of the reviews in 1920, 26 really is when we get sort of serious ones that are engaging with it rather than just summarizing it. They point out that he's misrepresenting sources. So in The Land of Mist, he will say something like, this is an example, the name is wrong here, but if you look at Charles Richet's work, he fully endorses that this happened. And, you'll have reporters saying, actually, if you look at the book, that's absolutely not what
Yeah.
he says. He says he couldn't say that it was, he couldn't say for sure it was a fraud, but he absolutely didn't say it was real. So there's a lot of massaging, edited positioning, but at the same time, I don't think we can doubt the sincerity of what Doyle is doing.
Yeah.
I think he thinks he's in the right.
Yeah, I was really struck by the fact that you do get that kind of good medium, bad medium. And the
Yeah.
chapters with Silas Linden are really hard hitting. It's a very for a novel that is often dismissed just as a kind of spiritualist propaganda piece. There's a lot of kind of social commentary in here as
Oh,
well.
completely.
The Linden stuff is really graphic and horrible. The domestic violence and cruelty.
Yeah.
It's actually quite a powerful piece of writing, I think that.
It is, yeah. Although it's interesting that the most violent parts of that episode, where we see again the rogue medium Silas, who's bad in every possible way, beating and torturing his children, is left out of the Strand serialization, and I think it's precisely for that reason that it is a bit too dark. It's a bit too violent. Something that I'm fascinated with, though, about the Silas and Tom Linden brothers, this is some very obscure spiritualist gossip chat. Um, I think they might be based on the real life Welsh mediums Will and Thomas and Tom Thomas, who Doyle was sitting with around the same time, also with Evan Powell. Um, and it's really interesting. So if he's basing Silas and Tom on this other brother pair, is he implying that one of those real
Yeah,
life brothers is also fraudulent?
yeah.
Um, because they're also like Silas, but both of those brothers were Welsh miners, really athletic, big burly guys. So I don't know if there's a little subtext there that we're not aware of, you know?
That's really interesting. The you mentioned as well that there are other characters who
Yeah.
populate the book that are, based on other characters. I think one of them isn't it Dr. Maupertuis is
Gustave Gillet, the French psychical
Gillet.
investigator. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean that and that kind of adds to the verisimilitude of it, I suppose, in that but I suppose he's bordering on libel in the case of the Linton brothers in that case.
Well, maybe it's only my brain that's making that connection. I don't know, but they're spiritualist brothers in any case. But yeah, there's a lot of portraits here, and I think this is, a little nod, a little Easter egg for spiritualist readers,
Yeah.
saying, here you go, here we all know. I'm going to call this person, whatever, but we all know who I'm talking about, and aren't they wonderful? Don't they do great work? So there's the Reverend Charles Mason, who is a Christian spiritualist minister who is based on the Reverend G. Vale Owen, who Doyle dedicates The Land of Mist to. We see him doing this really amazing exorcism
Mm.
in chapter 12, getting dark spirits out of a house. And then I've just recently tracked down the source of our nurse in the scene of psychic healing.
Oh,
It's chapter 14, I think, where he goes and sees a former colleague cured of God, what is it? Is it MS maybe?
yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, there's a real life sort of spirit doctor called Dr. Beale, who is apparently healing people and apparently raising the dead
Oh,
in a spiritualist hospital in God, I'm gonna the south of England in the early 1920s, and Doyle's get involved in that case. And I think that's a little portrait there as well, another kind of little vindication. So
mm,
there's a really non-subtle part of the argumentation of the land of mist, but there's also some more little subtle things that you would have to know the scene to know who he's talking
yeah.
about.
Which must make your job as an editor both fascinating and incredibly hard
Well,
because you're tracking in the annotations all
I
these
love it. It's
people.
why I've been working on this for so long, as Douglas knows, It's like every time I think I'm done, I'm like, no, wait, there's more to be said here.
Yeah. The other thing that comes out, sort of more in the kind of social commentary space, is the depiction of the police in this
Yeah.
is really interesting as well because I mean this Conan Doyle already had quite a well with certain police commissioners he didn't have very good. Anson he didn't have a very bad relationship with,
Hmm.
but here he seems like he's settling old scores in a lot of this in
Yeah.
Under the Mist. Under the Mist.
Completely, yeah. I mean, you'll probably know more about his relationships with actual police commissioners than me, but certainly The Land of Mist, in both the manuscript and the published book, are far more scathing about the corruption of the legal system than I think anything we've ever seen in Holmes, right? I mean, we see our worthy medium, Tom Linden, being entrapped by a couple of police women, you got to watch out for these
Yes.
professional women. They're newly in this role. They pretend to be grieving bereaved woman. They've lost a father and a husband. Um, and then there is all that chapter again that doesn't make it into the serial that shows the police officers laughing back at the station at what they've done and talking about what they're going to do with the fine, which is, to keep it for themselves. A lot of the work that Doyle is doing in this period is trying to hammer away at the two main laws that are used to prosecute mediums in the 1920s, which are the Witchcraft Act and the Vagrancy Act.
Mhm.
And then, of course, Helen Duncan is tried under neither of those. Is it the Official Secrets Act? Someone will
Official
know.
Secrets, I think, something like that. Yeah.
So a lot of the book is just, exposing. It's another thing that he has in common with Aleister Crowley, to be honest.
Yeah.
The short-sightedness and the hypocrisy of the law, right? So when Tom Linden is tried and he's sent away for telling fortunes, we learn that the hungover judge that is trying him is in a bad mood because like his horse racing tips haven't worked out. So he's
Yeah.
gambling all the time, and he's making forecasts and predictions, and that's perfectly fine. But what our good man Tom is doing is not. So yeah, there's absolute real palpable anger here because he's seen some of his closest friends and allies in the cause being sent away.
Yeah. Yeah, he's definitely feels like he's sort of getting a bit of revenge on the police and the way
Yeah,
they behaved
yeah,
for that. You mentioned there as well this the missing chapter, which
yeah.
has always fascinated me because I think it came up at Christie's auction, didn't it? And then
It did. Yeah, it was what was it 2019 maybe or no, maybe that's yes, I think Christie's then or perhaps that's when it went into the British Library. So
yes, that's right.
um I'm so excited to publish it.
I was going to say because this has not been published before, has it? This is
Never published. Now why that is not clear. It was in the Doyle family until 1955. So it wasn't lost. Like it was in possession of them. And initially I thought, okay, because it's quite explosive, the content, right? So that Doyle must have decided not to, that this was a deliberate decision not to put this in,
yeah.
because it undermined what he was trying to do in the rest of the book with spiritualism. But in, here's my first edition here, there is an appendix for this chapter. So if you just read the appendix on your own, there's one that goes, well, the young man in this chapter, as a reader in 1926, you'd be, what the hell? What are you talking about, right? So there does seem to have been some intention in the publication process
Oh,
to
that's
include
interesting.
it.
I had no idea that was the case. I've never spotted. So it's in the appendix, but it's not.
There's an appendix for the chapter, but there's no chapter.
And
Very
it is a dynamite chapter from what you told me. I haven't read the chapter, but this is about dark spirits.
dark
Um, yeah,
dark spirits, seductive spirits,
yeah.
and perhaps most dangerous of all, French spirits, right? So this
Oh,
is set in Paris. There already is a chapter in the book where our team of investigators go to Paris and they go to the Institut Métapsychique and they watch some manifestations there. And this chapter seems to have been intended to appear right before that because they're in France and they're talking about going there. And they interview this young Frenchman called Louis Lappé, right? And the first half of the chapter is it's the most intensively anti-Catholic part of the novel, right? So Lappé complains about the control that the Catholic Church have on free speech and investigation of the spirit world in France. And he says, you know what they are really concerned about? They're concerned about copyright infringement because they want to have exclusive control of, miraculous manifestations. They can't let that go. So it's quite blistering for that.
hmm.
And then we learn about poor Lappé, who is this very typical 1890s style decadent, effete, young neurotic poet. And he's been doing sittings along with a spirit called Sylvia, with whom he seems to have fallen in love, and maybe she with him. And she starts making these bizarre demands of him. She wants him to pay to have her name circulated in the leading French daily newspaper. I don't know what this is based on. I'd never heard of this being anything that spirits demanded. Anyway, she's basically extorting him and she wants to financially ruin him. It's kind of like spiritualist financial domination, something like
Yeah.
that. So he does this, and then when he tells her he's going to stop, she says, "Okay, we can stop it, but then you're going to be brushed by the wing of death." So this is a kind of death threat, and he's terrified. He has to seek counsel with the more sane British spiritualists, and who urge him to just drop the connection. But then there's a little dialogue at the end between, I think it's Roxton and Algernon Mailey, and Roxton's saying, the good thing about a story like this is it might reach people who don't want to listen to the higher stories. Maybe we should tell more stories like this. And Mailey goes, maybe. And that's kind of like the meta rationale for why Doyle wrote the chapter in the first place.
Indeed, yeah.
But then he didn't include it. So yeah, it's amazing.
I wondered if it was the sort of sexual content in that, because he is the person is infatuated, and but it's bizarre that the spirit wants to essentially trying to bribe him for fame.
Yeah, it's
Actually,
it's
that's
it's
been
a, it's a strange playing out of that. But yeah, of course, I mean, this has been the scandal around spiritualism from the very beginning, that it is a pretext for allowing men to be in a dark room with young women and to touch her, right?
yeah,
If we think
exactly.
about Florence Cook and William Crookes in the 1870s, or even the rumors around William Crawford and Kathleen Gallagher in the 19 teens, that he's besotted by her, and that's why he testifies
Mm.
to her mediumship. So yeah, that is definitely one of the threats. But it's also it's not just the chapters about kind of the sexual dangers. The chapter is also quite misogynist.
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah, when they have this discussion about the spirit Sylvia, and LaPay goes, "What do you think, Mr. Maley? Do you think that she was a demon?" And he goes, "Haha, no, it's just the eternal spirit of woman. If you look around you on the street, there's not a single woman who would not do the same,
Yeah.
and you're like,
Like the naughty female policemen who have been,
there is.
entrapping good, honest mediums, etc.
Yeah,
But just to end on
yeah,
that point, because as we're just getting up to halfway, I want to pass back to Ashley. But just before, the other thing that's really come out in your surveys, I think, is you've rightly put a focus back onto Enid,
yeah.
who is only in this novel. And I just wondered, what's her significance in this book? Why is she in this when Doyle hasn't necessarily used female characters? Well, he's not great on female characters generally, but
Yeah.
he certainly hasn't in telling these stories before.
Absolutely not. I mean, she's nowhere else in the Challenger timeline, right? It doesn't make sense. She suddenly appears and then she's sped off. He is here to provide the ultimate verification process that only a female medium can prove, right? Someone you can trust. So while Doyle wants his spiritualism to be masculine and rational and authentic and all of those things, he has this sort of also very kind of, well, maybe it's not strange, maybe it's typical, like quite patronizing chivalric attitude towards women and the supernatural, hence with the Cottingley
Yeah.
cousins. Of course, we believe them, they would never lie. Enid Challenger is someone who is absolutely above suspicion. She's Caesar's wife, right? So she's the only one who's ever going to convert Challenger in that final scene where she goes into trance and she brings this message from these men he thought he killed in an experimental trial. The possibility that she might be lying is simply Challenger cannot countenance it. So he is able to make his conversion by, the good woman who is also positioned as opposite to these other menacing kind of women who daunt and thwart the spiritualist progress elsewhere.
That's brilliant. Look, I think that's been fantastic half hour. Thank you so much, Christine. And I'm really, really looking forward to reading the book. I think the stuff that you're pushing, new understandings of Lost Land of Mist all the time. Every time I talk to you, you've discovered something else about it as well. So I think it'll be a great volume. When does it come out? Have you got a date
Well,
for?
I need to finish it first, but and Douglas, if you're listening, it will definitely be this summer. I just have to finish I would have to write the
Can't
introduction,
wait.
hopefully late 2012 or early 26.
Perfect. So that's exactly in timing for 100 years. Like it. Okay. Well, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass back to Ashley for the second half.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And boy, does that hit home. I just have to finish it. It's that lives close to my heart. So we're going to move from the specific to a kind of more broad discussion here. I'd like to introduce our three panelists who each come to this topic from a different angle. And my aim is to simply moderate a discussion. I'll hope that the three of you will jump in and respond to each other. But for our listeners out there, our panel is Mike Homer. Mike has written about Doyle's rejection of Roman Catholicism, his conversion to spiritualism, the sources that he relied on when he wrote A Study in Scarlet, as well as Angels of Darkness, and the similarities between spiritualism and Mormonism, his visit to Salt Lake City, and how that overlaps with his spiritualist missionary tours. We have Stephen Rothman. Stephen has been interested in Conan Doyle's spiritualist writings since he finished the canon and had to move on to something else, and moved on to that next, which is an interesting choice, and has holds Land of Mist with a special place in his heart, particularly the portrait of modern London and Conan Doyle's own experiences reflected in the novel. And Bob Stek. Bob has a professional interest in parapsychology and consciousness research, and has looked deeply into the literature on afterlife communication and spiritualism. He worked for 8 years at the University of Arizona Laboratory for Consciousness and Health, investigating anomalous events, including work with mediums. And I understand he's been visited by Conan Doyle, so I'm sure we'll hear about that as well. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for being here to talk about this.
Happy to be here.
Thanks. So let's start with a little bit of a defense of Conan Doyle, because most people tuning in probably start with Sherlock Holmes, and then we tend to kind of poo-poo his other works. So just the historical romances. Oh, his work on spiritualism. Why do you guys think that the spiritualist writings are really worth delving into and reading?
Mike, you want to go first?
Go ahead.
All right. Well, because this was the man's driving thing for what, half his life, a third of his life. This is what he put his real energy into. He had to know it was a losing fight from the beginning, but like any religious prophet, he felt the need to put so much energy, so much of his money, so much of his life into this. And it had to have affected, we know it affected his opinion in the press, in the public, and yet he did this. But Land of Mist becomes all the more fascinating because it is really his only 20th century novel. It's the only book that seriously is set in the 20th century. It gives us a picture of London then that's fascinating, vital, vibrant. It's a real city, and with real slums and scary places and corrupt police. And it's great. You know what these rooms looked like that they're meeting in. You could understand what was going on. And the energy that's there is just fascinating. Why Challenger? Because Holmes wouldn't have worked at all. Challenger barely works, but he was smart enough to take this fascinating character, this bombastic, huge, bigger than life thing that he'd created, and did this. The spiritualism fight is just so much fun. And the fairies bit, such nonsense that he writes about, and yet he writes about it so affectingly that you want to believe him while you're reading this stuff. And I'm hoping that Christine is looking at the parallel writings he was writing at the same time that he was doing the chapters for the book in the spiritualist press, because I would love to know date by date the arguments and the people that he was writing about there. I think that would tell us a lot of what the questions that came up in her talk with Mark just now.
Excellent. All right, so learn about Conan Doyle. Good.
Stephen, I would agree with you about his fervor after he finally turned, to a belief in spiritualism as a religion. But I would also argue that, the Challenger book gave him the opportunity to act as his own Sherlock Holmes. in that he's trying to provide a rational way of looking at spiritualism. He's trying to talk about, okay, maybe we can't prove, life after death in a scientific means, but why use that as the only criteria? Is the possibility of life after death beyond a reasonable doubt, or the preponderance of the evidence? How can we rationally look at these anomalous things? And Theodore Sturgeon came up with Sturgeon's law after being introduced as a writer of science fiction. He said, the person said, but you write science fiction. 90% of science fiction is crap. And he came up with Sturgeon's law. 90% of everything is crap. So it's the 10% that isn't crap that we have to investigate. And Sherlock Holmes would be that person who investigates. And so this was, even though Challenger wasn't the investigator, his daughter's boyfriend tried to take it step by step, rule out, things that were fraudulent. You can't do that in, just one book. There's a lot of information out there, and the deeper you look, the more interesting it is.
Yeah, and Ashley, my response on why it's important to study Doyle's spiritualist beliefs is because, let's face it, at the end of his life and even before, and on virtually all of his trips abroad proselytizing spiritualism, he says there's only two things that anybody wants to hear about from Arthur Conan Doyle. One, of course, Sherlock Holmes, but then he said two, spiritualism. And remember, in the famous movie tone interview that he did in 1927, those are the two topics that he talked about. And so I think in order to really understand Arthur Conan Doyle, you have to immerse yourself in his belief in spiritualism, which, as we all know, he began investigating in the 1880s. And in fact, there's two letters in the public record published in Light where he said, "I am converted." He wasn't on his way to conversion. He said, "I am converted." And then he took a break after he left Portsmouth, Southsea. And then, of course, with the death that occurred during World War I, he became reconverted. And it was through female mediums, the friend of his wife. And I would argue that Enid in The Land of Mist is really Jean Conan Doyle, because remember, she was his medium in bringing in the messages of Phineas. And so I think that, obviously he was receiving these messages from Phineas before The Land of Mist was published, first in the Strand in the 25, and then, of course, in book form in 1926. And so if her presence and her belief and her trust in his belief and his trust in Jean was paramount in reinforcing his belief in spiritualism. So I think that's the way we understand Arthur Conan Doyle, is primarily on his religious beliefs, but then, of course, on his other writings as well.
Interesting. I think that it's valuable for us as, folks who are fans of the fiction, the Sherlock Holmes character, that's what the Literary Agents is about, right? Stepping back and recognizing that there's a real human being and we have to take him as he was, right? We don't get to ignore all the other stuff and go, oh, well, he got duped by things at the end of his life, or he was naive or anything. He cared so deeply about it that, as you say, it took over his whole life and his time and his treasure, and that's what he poured himself into. Let's talk a little bit more about the novel. So it's interesting that he's made a very, very clever choice to leverage this character to try to make his argument, rather than doing one more, article, one more piece of nonfiction, to try to fictionalize this world. Uh, and it's kind of Challenger, but not Challenger. He doesn't actually appear that much. It's more the other characters from the Challenger canon. How do you feel it works as an argument? I'm curious. How do you feel like leveraging Challenger in this way works?
Well,
Is
I
it a
think,
successful defense?
right. I think that Doyle recognized that in many cases, fiction is more persuasive than nonfiction. I mean, after all, I will tell you from the perspective of Mormons that they are still surprised by the impact that A Study in Scarlet has on the reputation of the Mormon Church, even into the 21st century. And so, and I have argued elsewhere that A Study in Scarlet probably is more responsible for the worldwide opinions of Mormonism than any book, fiction or nonfiction. And so I think he understood that, but ultimately, The Land of Mist is just another proselyting pamphlet, so to speak. I mean, he understood that perhaps the best way to persuade people was through a fictional account, and it contains everything that's in his other nonfiction works and pamphlets. Including the fact that scientists, if they really pay attention and look at spiritualism, they will embrace it. And the fact that people should reject dogma and look for proof. And, all of the themes that were previously enunciated in the New Revelation and then the vital message and his other pamphlets after that are replicated and expanded in The Land of Mist. So in that sense, I think it probably has more staying power, quite frankly, than his nonfiction works. But whether or not it's more persuasive, I guess, would depend on how many converts really came about because of the publication of the book.
That would require more digging into light than I think any of us want to do. But you're right. I think that Enid is his wife in many ways, and the same. But then the talk of the French spirit there earlier that Christine was reminding us of is very like what she was doing with Phineas, saying, "You don't want to go to America. It would be a bad idea to go to America," over and over and over again, when Jean clearly did not want to make that trip. The whole argument here is his spiritualism a rejection of his Catholicism as a boy? I don't know that any of us have really thought about this in a way. I know I haven't until right now. And you brought this up, but I think this is part of it, because after all, the Doyle family was almost professional Catholics, except they didn't seem to be religious, but they were, so many of them depended upon the Catholic community for their jobs and their standing. And here he was giving all of that up because he had his own standing, so he could do that and took on this new fight. But he liked fights. But Challenger's a curious character to use. Challenger's not an investigator. Challenger's an explorer. He's going off to a lost world. He's digging into the earth to find out what's what. He's never really thinking about the problems in the way that we saw with Holmes. He's wants to go off and confront the problems and just say, "Oh, look, there they are. There's ghosties out there. There's monsters over there. Look, the earth is alive. There's a horrible man with a disintegration machine." It's all the same sort of thing. So, thoughts?
Speaking of light, I don't know if Conan Doyle and the Mysterious World of Light by Matt Wingett. I mean, I really appreciated that book because it does present a lot of his writings directly, from light. So you can see his arguments in much more detail. And there's a lot there. I agree. I mean, this was a proselytizing effort. He tried to, hit the highlights. and, get people to, well, this seems reasonable. If a person could read the Holmes stories and think it reasonable that Holmes was a real life human being, perhaps they could read this Professor Challenger and think, gee, these arguments, they work. That's okay. I can go along with this. This makes sense.
You can go along with it while you're reading it, but then the minute you walk away, you say, "Oh my God, he's
Well,
talking about
that is the deeper psychological question, for me, in that you can have a scientist investigate anything and people look at it and say, well, if other scientists agree, that I guess that makes sense. They went about it in a scientific manner. You talk about spiritualism and, the research, and there is, a body of research that, like I said, maybe 90% of it is crap, but the 10% that keeps coming through again and again, you have to say, well, why can't we accept, what they have found? I mean, we don't have a complete explanation. I'm not saying it's 100% true, but why is there such a, no, this cannot be, this is terrible, this is awful, you're a terrible person, you're crazy. Wait a minute, just look at the facts. Even Holmes would say, data, 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 I can't make bricks without clay.
Picking up
there's
the
not quite enough clay.
Yeah.
But
picking up the thread from Steve on the connection between Doyle's rejection of Roman Catholicism and his embrace of spiritualism, I don't think there's any doubt that his experiences in Lancashire and in Austria at the Jesuit boarding schools caused him to reject Catholicism. And then he had a void in his life, of course, and as has been mentioned, he came from a very strict Roman Catholic family. And I think in order to further expand our knowledge of Arthur Conan Doyle, we need to look back at Charles Altamont Doyle and also Richard Doyle, his uncle, who were extremely interested and persuaded by Catholicism. But I do think that he thought that the answer was, okay, let's reject dogma, which is not based on anything other than what the church tells us to believe as opposed to personal experiences, and let's embrace knowledge versus believing. In other words, by having, as Bob indicated, experiences that can either persuade or not persuade, but at least they're real experiences that one has either in a seance room or elsewhere, that seem to indicate that, okay, one-on-one, I have communicated with a spirit world. And so I think that's, even though people don't understand how the creator of Sherlock Holmes could have become a believer in spiritualism, I think it's obvious that he believed that through looking at the evidence, that the evidence proved up spiritualism, whereas it didn't prove the dogmas that he had been taught as a young man.
Yeah, I think one of the things that jumped out at me, I just finished rereading The Land of Mist, and I was shocked by how actually prosaic the spiritualist beliefs actually feel to me. They don't feel to me, and I'm somebody that Conan Doyle would have, derided as an arch materialist. So they don't feel to me that different from any other, as Conan Doyle presents them anyway, different than other sort of Christian sects. It does sort of, it's odd to me that it goes out into it's categorized as something entirely different when it doesn't feel like those beliefs are that far afield of other, for instance, mainstream Protestant belief systems. Thoughts on that? Because I think each of the three of you also come from different faith traditions, so it's sort of an interesting.
Yeah, I'll just comment on that, Ashley, that those in mainstream religions who criticize spiritualists or others who believe in that you can have communication with the spirit world, I always point out to them that many of the claims that the mainstream religions make are just as dubious as those of spiritualists and others. I mean, look at the origins of Christianity. It was really based on this idea that Christ died, was resurrected, and then came back and communicated. And of course, Doyle loved to point out those parallels because his belief was that the early Christians were spiritualists. And so, yeah, I think it's very dangerous to criticize minority religions in general, but spiritualism from the perspective, I mean, unless you're a materialist and you don't believe there's any communication at all, and that all religions have fabricated those sorts of things. But if you come from a church that believes in the hereafter, it's very dangerous to criticize others that have the same belief but don't necessarily fall in line with the mainstream tenets.
Yes, I would also argue that even a materialist shouldn't take for granted criticisms of any faith traditions.
Sure.
Enter
Mike,
into discussions.
I think
Mike, I'm
that
interested. Oh, no, Bob, please.
I think that spiritualism, and I think even Doyle at some point said basically his spiritualism was a generalized Christianity with the added belief that you continue somehow after death, and there are certain people that are able to communicate with them. So the rest of the belief structure and the morality and whatever else Christianity may teach, was perfectly fine with Doyle, I think. And it was that period, yes, he did make that, one statement in light very early on, but then I don't so much he rejected it, he decided to go the scientific route. Give me the proof, show me the data, what are leading scientists saying? I mean, it's kind of an ad hominem argument. All these very bright people are saying there's something here that we should look at carefully.
But Doyle was also always used the Siebert Commission as his touchstone for the proof on everything. And they never published a full report. They only published their preliminary report, which had considerable doubt as to what they had found. And yet he ignored all of that and just said, the Siebert Commission of Philadelphia, blah, blah, blah. And, there is no final report. And I think they thought they didn't find anything that they felt was convincing in the least, but he ignored all of that. And he would, willingly thought that Marconi was talking to spirits with the radio. And
I mean, he did become, he went too far, even from my point of view, which is more sympathetic to him. Definitely. And yet at the same time, even with the Cottingley fairies, I mean, when one of the two sisters said, we made it up, and showed these 5 photographs. Well, these 4 we did, but that last one, no, that was the real fairy. So it's like, okay, I mean, what do you do with that?
So, Mike, I'm interested. You're the only one of us who has missionary experience. So how do you feel about the proselytizing part of Land of Mist and of Conan Doyle's work in trying to convince people of a belief system?
Well, and remember that Mormon missionaries are mentioned in the Land of Mist, in the sense that a good devoted spiritualist could take on a Mormon missionary in their proselytizing efforts. No, I mean, it's there's dozens of books written about fictional accounts of Mormon missionaries going out and spreading the message and explaining how it all works. So I think there is a parallel there between the Land of Mist and other proselytizing missions. And I believe there's also growing literature on Jehovah's Witnesses who are totally into proselytizing as well. And you see them on the streets all the time. I'm not sure if they knock on doors anymore. But I think it's a very similar situation, particularly if you take into account you walk in to a home, explain your tenants, and you can either be rejected outright or there's still curiosity, and so they invite further dialogue. And of course, that's essentially what happened in the Land of Mists, is that they got to the point where, of course, Enid went into trance and demonstrated to her father that there really was a spirit world. So it's, but it's a marketing campaign. I mean, proselytizing is nothing more than marketing.
Yes.
And it is also interesting that there's we tend to demand more proof from denominations or sects of Christianity especially, but all faith traditions, I think, that are the more recently they are developed, the more that we demand that they meet our burdens of evidence as they stand. So the kind of evidence that we demand from somebody who's proselytizing a tradition that's developing in the 19th century, we demand evidence. We demand 19th century evidence. We want to see it. We want to touch it. And we don't demand the same standards of evidence from a 15th century faith tradition or a 10th century faith tradition or a 2nd century faith tradition. So it's interesting. We have different standards, I think, and they become more challenging to meet when you have to go to somebody's front door and you're competing with their smartphone. Conan Doyle never had to do that, but I have no doubt he would have. We're coming down to the end. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I would like you guys to I would invite you to recommend a reading that isn't The Land of Mist, that everybody listening should read to jump into this topic.
I think I would recommend Through a Glass Darkly by Stefan Bechtel and Lawrence Roy Staines, because it goes through, many of the arguments that Doyle makes, but puts it in perspective and is very neutral. It doesn't say disproves spiritualism or it disproves spiritualism, but it presents a lot of very good information, about Doyle and his journey from scientific exploration to complete religious conversion into spiritualism.
Excellent.
Yeah, and in order to understand better Doyle's perspective, I would recommend, even though it's an extremely difficult book to get through, and that's The History of Spiritualism, because it's very dense and not integrated very well. But I think if you really want to understand where Doyle was coming from with respect to spiritualism, you need to go back to that after you read The Land of Mist, or even before.
And I was going to say, well, The History of Spiritualism is almost unreadable. But I mean, it's fascinating because you do need to understand all the odd stories and development of spiritualism over the 70 years before Conan Doyle went onto it. But really, I think Edge of the Unknown, or The New Revelation, really Edge of the Unknown, because it's final bits of journalist work, and yet he's talking pretty convincingly about his beliefs, but he was writing it in the popular press, so it's all there for people to believe. He wasn't writing for the converted in most of those articles. It mostly is from the Strand. So I would say, if you wanted to just get an idea that isn't Land of Mist, but understanding what ACD thought was going to help you understand that life doesn't end, keep going on, and that's where I would go. Because
Yeah,
that was his real message. His message was hope. His
Yeah.
message was hope, that you were going to get back with all your loved ones. And is that a bad message? It's not. It's a lovely message.
Yeah.
No,
Another book that I'd recommend, I'm not sure if there's been a reprint of it, it's called The Roman Catholic Church: A Rejoinder. And that was one of the last books that Doyle wrote. And that will tee up the tension between his former belief in Roman Catholicism and his current belief in spiritualism.
Excellent. All right. We all now have our reading lists. So now that you have had your appetites whetted, you know where to go. Any last words, Mark, before we adjourn our meeting?
Just one thing, because which is that when you registered, we asked you a question, which was who was right, Conan Doyle, Harry Houdini, or Sherlock Holmes? And the results are Harry Houdini was 13%, Conan Doyle was 17%, and Sherlock Holmes was 70%. Just goes to prove that if you ask people a facetious question, you get a facetious answer. So thank you for making my day when I read that poll result this morning.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Christine, for being here. And we'll see you again next year on a topic that Mark and I will probably figure out in like 6 months in a panic.
Yeah. And thanks, Matt, for hosting.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And thank
everybody.
you,
Thanks, everyone,
Christine.
for joining.
Brilliant day.
It was lots of fun.
Thanks, guys. That was
Thank you.
great.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.